Hey guys, we're back with morning Bible study, and today we are in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. I'm going to read through all the verses first, and then we'll break down each verse with my notes. So starting in verse 1, it says, After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, For this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. When Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. After they heard the king, they went on their way, and the star had been seen when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So from reading this passage, we see that everyone responds to Jesus differently. Some ignore him, some worship him, some oppose him. The question isn't whether or not we're going to respond to Jesus, it's how we're going to respond. So what's happening in the beginning of this passage is that Jesus has been born in Bethlehem and fulfilling prophecy from Micah 5:2. And it talks about the Magi, or often called the wise men. They were likely astrologers or scholars from Persia or Babylon. Something interesting is that they were Gentiles. They were not Jews, which is significant because they recognized Jesus before many of God's people did. They saw a unique star and understood that it meant a king had been born. And what's awesome here is that God used something familiar to them, which was the stars, to draw them towards Christ. They traveled hundreds of miles without knowing exactly where they were heading, and they sought Jesus because they believed he was worth it before they ever had even met him. God often meets people where they are and leads them towards the truth. Seeking Jesus usually requires effort, sacrifice, and faith. When we get into verses 3 through 6, we're seeing Herod's response in this, and the fact that he wasn't excited, he was threatened. The thing about King Herod is that he actually would anybody who he felt like was competition, even members of his own family. So when he hears that there's a king of the Jews, he's immediately thinking politically, not spiritually. Herod asked the chief priests, the scribes, where the Messiah would be born, and ironically, they knew the scriptures. They quoted the prophecy perfectly, but they didn't go see Jesus. And in contrast to that, the Magi, they didn't know scripture well, but they traveled miles to go and worship him. And this just shows that knowledge without obedience accomplishes nothing. Knowing about Jesus isn't the same thing as actively pursuing him. So when we get to verses 7 through 8, he told them, Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. And so he was sounding spiritual, but his heart was evil. He wasn't actually intending to worship Jesus. And this just reminds us that not everybody who talks about God has good motives. God sees what people cannot. And when we get into verses 9 through 10, this just shows that God faithfully continues to lead them, and then they experienced overwhelming joy. Sometimes God gives us just the next step. He's not going to give us the whole map, and faith often means following one step at a time. So when we get to verse 11, just look at it closely. The Magi did not worship the star. They did not worship the miracle. They worshiped Jesus. They fell down. This shows that worship involves humility. They gave him gifts. 3 of the gifts that they gave him were gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold was usually given to kings, and this represents Jesus's kingship. And then they gave him frankincense, which is used in worship by priests. And this just points to Jesus's deity and his role as our high priest. They also gave him myrrh, which is used for burial, which foreshadows Jesus' suffering and his death. So even as a child, his birth already pointed towards the cross, and true worship costs something. The Magi gave their time, they gave their effort, their comfort, their resources, and their hearts. When we get to verse 12, the Magi were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. And so this just shows God protecting them. And instead of returning to Herod, they obeyed God. So sometimes obedience means changing your plans. Even when God redirects us, it's always for a purpose, and even if we don't understand it. So the main points of this whole passage is, number one, everyone's heart responds differently to Jesus. The Magi worshiped, Herod opposed, and the religious leaders ignored, but we still see these same responses today. Number two, Jesus is king for everyone. So the first people recorded worshiping Jesus after his birth were Gentiles. Matthew begins showing that Jesus didn't only come for Israel, he came for the whole world. Number three, God faithfully guides those who seek him, and the Magi followed the light that they had, and God kept giving them more direction. This doesn't mean that every sincere search automatically leads to the truth, but it does show that God's gracious initiative in revealing himself. Throughout Scripture, God delights in revealing himself to people and making himself known to those who genuinely seek him. And number four, worship is more than words. The Magi worshiped through their journey, their humility, their gifts, their obedience, and real worship changes how we live every single day. Thank you for listening in, and I will see y'all tomorrow to continue in the book of Matthew.